The BMW in my driveway was the first wrong note, and I noticed it before I'd even put my own car in park. My name is William. I was 38 years old, a regional operations manager for a mid-sized freight distribution company, and I was supposed to be 400 miles away in Pittsburgh for a supplier audit that wasn't scheduled to wrap up until Friday. Instead, it was Wednesday, 7:40 in the evening, and I was sitting in my own driveway in Ashford, Pennsylvania, staring at a black BMW sedan I didn't recognize, engine still ticking with warmth in the cool spring air, feeling the specific, disorienting confusion of a man looking at a puzzle piece that doesn't belong to any puzzle he owns. The audit had ended early. Our supplier's warehouse manager had walked us through the entire inventory reconciliation in a day and a half instead of 3, and rather than sit in a hotel room padding out a trip that no longer needed padding, I'd driven straight home, already composing in my head the surprised, pleased look I imagined on Emily's face when I walked through the door 2 days ahead of schedule. 15 years of marriage teaches you to look forward to small things like that, the unscheduled Tuesday, the early homecoming, the version of your spouse who lights up because you weren't supposed to be there yet. The house was dark except for one window. Our bedroom, upstairs, a warm seam of light along the edge of the blackout curtains Emily had insisted on installing 2 winters earlier, for better sleep, she'd said. I remember standing in the driveway a moment too long, keys still in my hand, trying to construct an ordinary explanation for an unfamiliar car and a single lit window in a house where every other light was off, a client's car, maybe, someone from her design firm dropping off fabric samples, a neighbor's visitor who'd parked in the wrong driveway by mistake. I let myself in the front door as quietly as 15 years of habit made automatic, and that quiet, I'll admit now, wasn't caution. It was still just courtesy, the reflex of a man trying not to wake a house he assumed was simply asleep, or distracted, or ordinary. I heard the sound before I reached the stairs. Low voices. A laugh that wasn't Emily's laugh, a man's laugh, easy and unhurried, coming from directly above me. I want to be honest about the several seconds that followed, because they matter more than anything else in this story. I stood at the bottom of our staircase, hand on the banister, and some old, stubborn part of me constructed one final, absurd explanation, a television left on, a podcast, anything, even as the rest of me had already understood, with a clarity that arrived faster than I wanted it to, exactly what I was about to find. I climbed the stairs. The bedroom door was half open. What I saw in the gap took less than 2 seconds to register and considerably longer than that to actually believe, my wife, Emily, in our bed, with a man I recognized instantly, not because I'd expected to see him there, in the single place on earth I'd least expected to see him, but because I'd worked under him for 6 years. Colin. My direct supervisor. The man who'd signed off on my last 3 performance reviews, who'd sat across from me at 100 planning meetings, who'd shaken my hand at the company holiday party 4 months earlier and told me I was one of the good ones. I didn't say anything. I want that understood clearly, because everything that came afterward in this story depends on that first decision, made in under 3 seconds, without any real thought behind it at all. I stepped back from the door instead of through it, and I took out my phone. I didn't examine why I did that in the moment. It was instinct, the same instinct that had built my entire career on documentation, on paper trails, on never walking into a dispute with a client or a vendor without something concrete in hand. I pressed record. I stood in the hallway of my own house, my back against the wall beside our bedroom door, and I filmed 23 minutes of my marriage ending, because some cold, functioning part of my brain had already understood that whatever I felt in the moment would matter far less, in the end, than what I could prove. I heard Emily's voice through the door at one point, low and unhurried in a way that turned my stomach worse than anything else that evening, not the voice of someone hiding something in a rush, but someone comfortable, someone who'd done this enough times that it no longer required urgency. She said something about, when the locks get changed, and Colin laughed again, that same easy laugh, and said something about not worrying about the timeline, that he'd handle me. I stood there in the dark hallway of my own house, recording the sound of 2 people casually discussing the mechanics of taking my life apart, and I felt something in my chest go very, very still. I want to stop here for a second. If you've ever stood somewhere silent, holding something in your hands, waiting for your own heartbeat to catch up with what your eyes had already told you was true. You know exactly the kind of stillness I mean. It isn't calm. It's closer to a held breath that doesn't know yet how long it's going to have to last. I recorded until the sounds inside the room shifted toward the ordinary aftermath of two people getting up, getting dressed, and only then did I put the phone away, walk back downstairs without a single footstep out of place, and let myself back out the front door as quietly as I'd come in. I sat in my car at the end of the block for 11 minutes before I could make my hands stop shaking enough to drive. Here is what I knew: sitting in that car, my wife of 15 years was sleeping with my direct supervisor, in our bed, in our house, while I was supposedly 400 miles away doing my job. Here is what I did not yet know, and would only learn over the following days, piece by careful piece: how long it had actually been going on, how many of my extended business trips over the past year had been engineered rather than assigned, and just how completely the two people I trusted most in my professional and personal life had been coordinating, behind a closed door, to build a version of my future that didn't include me at all. I drove to a motel off Route 30 that night instead of going back inside. I told myself I needed time to think. What I actually needed, though I couldn't have named it yet, was time to become the version of myself who could walk back into that house without saying a single word about what I already knew, because somewhere in those 11 minutes in the car, before I'd even started the engine, I had already decided something. When I finally confronted this, it would not be with raised voices in a doorway. It would be with something Colin and Emily couldn't talk their way around, laid out so completely that neither of them would have anywhere left to stand. I texted Emily from the motel that night, audit wrapped early, staying in Pittsburgh one more night for a client dinner, home tomorrow as planned. She replied within 2 minutes, sounds good, miss you, drive safe tomorrow, and I sat on the edge of a motel bed I didn't recognize, in a town 20 minutes from the house I'd lived in for a decade, reading those 4 ordinary words from my wife, and understood that I had just watched her lie to me for the first time with my own eyes still adjusting to everything else she'd been lying about for months, maybe longer. I didn't know it yet, but that text message, casual, warm, utterly unremarkable, was the first of several lies I'd be able to prove, once I finally sat down with everything I had and started building, piece by piece, the case that would end both of their careers before it ever ended my marriage. I didn't sleep at that motel. I lay on top of the comforter with my shoes still on, staring at the ceiling, replaying 6 years of Colin's voice in 100 conference rooms, trying to locate the exact moment his easy, confident manner had become something I should have distrusted instead of admired. I want to go back further than that Wednesday night, though, because the truth of this story doesn't actually start with a BMW in my driveway. It starts almost a year earlier, in small administrative decisions I signed off on without a second thought, because I'd built my entire career on the assumption that my supervisor's judgment and my wife's honesty were 2 fixed points I never needed to question. Colin became my direct supervisor 2 years into my time at the company, and for most of those 6 years, our relationship was exactly what it should have been: professional, occasionally social, built on a foundation of him trusting my numbers and me trusting his direction. He'd been to our house twice for company barbecues. Emily had always liked him, in the ordinary way you like your spouse's boss, polite interest, nothing more, or so I'd assumed. The business trip started increasing in frequency around the previous spring. Not dramatically, an extra day tacked onto a routine supplier visit here. We should really send you to handle this personally instead of a call, there. Colin had a way of framing these extensions that made them feel like compliments. You're the only one I trust to actually close this out right, William. I ate that up, if I'm honest. I'd worked hard for 6 years to be the guy whose judgment mattered enough to warrant a personal trip instead of a phone call, and I never once stopped to ask why so many of those trips seemed to cluster around weeks when Emily had mentioned, almost in passing, a big project deadline of her own. Here's something I noticed and dismissed: back in the fall, Emily's design firm had picked up a new corporate client that required, according to her, frequent evening consultations, a boutique hotel renovation downtown, timelines that apparently only worked after regular business hours. I remember thinking it was strange that an interior design consultation needed to happen at 9 at night, but I also remember thinking that I didn't understand her industry well enough to question its rhythms, and that seemed like a reasonable place to leave it. I want to stop here for a second. If you've ever built a life around trusting two specific people completely, so completely that you stopped actually looking at them, the way you stop looking at a load-bearing wall you've walked past 10,000 times, you already understand the particular blindness I'm describing. It isn't stupidity. It's a kind of faith that feels, from the inside, exactly like good judgment. By winter, the pattern had a shape to it, if I'd been willing to trace the shape. Colin started scheduling my trips himself rather than letting them come through the regional dispatch system, which I noted only as a minor procedural quirk. He likes to handle logistics personally, that's just Colin, never as the deliberate removal of a paper trail that anyone else might have questioned. Emily, meanwhile, started keeping her phone face down on the counter in a way she never used to, and when I asked her about it once, lightly, she laughed and said she was trying to break a bad habit of checking it too much during dinner. I believed her, because believing her required no effort at all, and doubting her would have required tearing down a wall I'd spent 15 years building. There was a night in January I still think about. I came home from a same-day trip, one of the few Colin hadn't extended, and found Emily unusually affectionate, unusually present, asking detailed questions about my day in a way she hadn't in months. I remember feeling grateful for it, thinking maybe we'd both been busy and were finding our way back to each other. I understand now, in a way I couldn't let myself understand then, that guilt sometimes looks exactly like tenderness, and I had no framework yet for telling the two apart. She told me, much later, what that particular night had actually been. I didn't know it then. This is what she was living through, on her side of things, while I sat across from her feeling grateful. I remember that night specifically because it was 2 days after Colin had told me he thought we should slow down, just for a while, because things were getting complicated with his own marriage falling apart around the edges. I was terrified he was pulling away, and I think some ugly, desperate part of me turned all of that fear into being unusually warm toward William instead, like I could balance the scales somehow, be a better wife for one evening to make up for what I was doing the rest of the time. I told myself, lying next to him that night, that this was the version of me trying to come back. I didn't come back. I just got better at performing what coming back would have looked like. That's what she told me. I knew none of it yet. That January night, all I felt was relief that whatever distance had been growing between us seemed, for one evening, to be closing. By February, the affair had apparently entered what I'd later understand was its most confident phase, the period, Emily eventually admitted, when neither she nor Colin believed they'd ever actually get caught, because the system Colin had built around scheduling my trips personally had worked flawlessly for the better part of a year. I noticed, that month, that Emily had started using a new signature scent, something sharper than the drugstore vanilla she'd worn since college. When I asked, she said a client had given it to her as a thank you gift. I told myself that made sense. Clients give gifts. I had no reason yet to build a different story. My own blind spot, if I'm honest with myself now, wasn't really about Colin or Emily individually. It was a lifelong habit of extending complete trust to anyone who'd earned a position of authority in my life, whether that was a supervisor or a spouse, and never revisiting that trust once it had been granted. I built relationships the way I built spreadsheets, set the formula once, then stopped checking the inputs. It had served me well at work for years. It left me completely unequipped to notice that the two formulas closest to my own life had started referencing each other behind my back. There was one moment that spring, in early March, that I filed away without understanding its weight until months later. I mentioned to Colin, in passing, over coffee in his office, that Emily and I hadn't taken a real vacation in 2 years, that maybe once the Pittsburgh supplier situation stabilized I'd take her somewhere. Colin's face did something small and strange, a flicker I read, at the time, as simple distraction, a man thinking about his own workload. I understand now that I just described, out loud, to the very man sleeping with my wife, a plan that directly threatened the arrangement he and Emily had spent months building around my travel schedule. I didn't think about that flicker again until the following week, when Colin abruptly extended my Pittsburgh trip from 3 days to 5, citing complications with the supplier's inventory system that, when I later checked the actual documentation, never existed at all. The extended Pittsburgh trip in March was, I understand now, the moment the whole architecture of the affair actually started to crack, though at the time, I only registered it as an inconvenience. Another few days away from home I grumbled about to Emily over the phone and then accepted, because Colin's judgment was still, in my mind, a fixed point I didn't question. But something had shifted after that coffee conversation, even if I couldn't name what. I started noticing things that spring with a kind of low-grade, unfocused unease, not suspicion exactly, more like the sense of standing in a room where the furniture has been rearranged slightly and you can't say what's different, only that something is. The first concrete thing was a receipt. I found it by accident, doing laundry, in the pocket of a blazer Emily rarely wore, a charge from a boutique hotel 40 minutes outside Ashford, dated to a Tuesday I remembered specifically because I'd been in Pittsburgh that week. $210, a single night. I asked her about it that evening, trying to keep my voice light. She said it was a site visit for the downtown renovation project, that sometimes the client wanted her to stay overnight near the property to catch the morning light for photography purposes. It was a plausible answer. Interior designers, for all I knew, did stay overnight for lighting. I let it go, though I noticed, filing it away without examining it, that the receipt itemized a king room, not the kind of accommodation a solo work trip usually required. Here's another thing I noticed and dismissed. Emily started keeping a separate calendar on her phone that spring, one she said was for client scheduling only, distinct from our shared family calendar. When I glanced at her phone once, reaching past it for the TV remote, she picked it up faster than the moment called for, laughing a little too quickly, saying something about not wanting me to see how disorganized her actual client list looked. I laughed with her. I didn't ask what disorganization looked like enough to need hiding. I want to stop here for a second. If you've ever felt a specific, low static running under an otherwise ordinary life, nothing you could point to, nothing you could bring to anyone as evidence, just a hum you'd gotten so used to you almost stopped hearing it, you already know the particular fog I was walking through that spring. I didn't have a name for it yet. I just knew that Emily, who used to tell me the small, boring details of her day without my even asking, had started giving me summaries instead of stories, and I told myself that's simply what 15 years does to a marriage. I told myself the summaries were normal. There was a Thursday in April I still think about closely. Colin called me into his office to discuss the Pittsburgh supplier account, a legitimate conversation, on the surface, about inventory discrepancies that did need addressing, and near the end of it, almost as an aside, he asked how Emily's renovation project was coming along. It was such a small, ordinary question. Bosses ask about spouses. But something about the specificity of it, he knew the client's name, a detail I didn't remember ever mentioning to him directly, sat wrong in a way I couldn't articulate at the time. I told myself Emily must have mentioned it at some company function. I didn't examine that explanation very hard, because examining it would have required admitting I didn't actually know how he'd know that. She told me, much later, what that same week had actually looked like from where she was standing. I didn't know it then. This is what was happening on her end while I sat in Colin's office not quite naming my own unease. I remember that week because it was the week Colin told me he thought we needed to be more careful. Someone at his gym had apparently seen his car near our neighborhood and made an offhand comment that spooked him badly. I was furious at how calm he stayed about it and terrified underneath my own calm, because I understood, in a way I hadn't let myself understand before, that if this actually came apart, it wouldn't just end an affair. It would end William's career too, since Colin was his direct supervisor, and some sick, bargaining part of my brain spent that whole week telling myself that meant it could never actually come apart, that the stakes were too high for either of us to be careless. I told myself the fear meant we'd be more careful. I didn't understand yet that fear like that doesn't make people careful. It just makes them quieter about the same mistakes. That's what she told me. I knew none of it yet. That Thursday, all I had was a stray comment from my boss that didn't sit right, and no framework yet for understanding why. By May, the behavioral shifts had sharpened into something I could no longer entirely explain away, even with my formula and forget approach to trust. Emily started sleeping poorly, and I'd wake at odd hours to find her side of the bed empty, her sitting downstairs in the dark with her phone face down on the kitchen table in front of her, not doing anything, just sitting. When I asked if she was okay, she said work stress, the renovation deadline, and came back to bed rigid, not actually sleeping for a long while after. She also started over-explaining small things that didn't need explanation, why she'd stopped at a coffee shop across town, why a meeting had run late, why she'd needed to reschedule a dinner with my sister twice in 1 month. Small things. The kind of things a person only rehearses an explanation for when they're bracing for a bigger question underneath it, though I didn't understand the grammar of behavior yet. The most significant sign that spring, in hindsight, involved my direct reports at work. My assistant, a sharp, observant woman named Priya who handled my travel scheduling before Colin started taking it over personally, mentioned to me almost in passing that she'd found it strange Colin had specifically requested to route my Pittsburgh paperwork through his own office instead of the standard system. She said it lightly, as an odd administrative quirk, nothing more. I told her it was probably just Colin being hands-on about a difficult account. I didn't ask myself why a regional supervisor would want personal, direct control over one specific employee's travel logistics, when every other manager on our floor let dispatch handle it automatically. I didn't think about Priya's comment again until 3 weeks later, sitting in a hallway outside my own bedroom door with a phone in my hand, finally understanding exactly why Colin had wanted that particular kind of control. By early June, the tension in the house had a texture I couldn't ignore anymore, even filtered through my particular gift for not looking directly at things. Emily and I had a strange, charged conversation one night about the future, vague, unprompted, her asking whether I ever thought about starting over somewhere, whether I'd ever consider a different city if the right opportunity came along. I took it, at the time, as ordinary marital restlessness, the kind of conversation any couple has after 15 years. I understand now that I was being quietly, carefully surveyed for how I might react to a life reorganized around someone else's plans. I didn't confront any of it. I told myself, that whole spring, that a good husband trusts his wife and respects his supervisor, and that suspicion without proof was simply a failure of character on my part. It would take one more business trip, the Pittsburgh audit that ended a day and a half early, before all of it stopped being static I could file away, and became something I'd walk upstairs into, in the dark, on an ordinary Wednesday evening in May. I checked into the motel Wednesday night. By Thursday morning, I understood that whatever came next couldn't be built on a single 23-minute recording, however damning. If I wanted this handled the way I'd already decided, in that car at the end of the block, that I wanted it handled, quietly, completely, on my terms, I needed more than one piece of evidence. I needed a case. I drove to the office instead of home that Thursday, telling Emily by text that the client dinner had run long and I'd decided to stay one more night before the drive back. She replied with a heart emoji. I sat with that heart emoji longer than I probably should have, turning my phone over in my hand at a gas station off Route 30, feeling something curdle in my chest that had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with the specific loneliness of being lied to affectionately. At the office, I went looking, carefully, methodically, the way I'd trace an inventory discrepancy back through 6 months of shipping manifests. I started with my own travel records, cross-referencing every trip Colin had personally extended against the company's actual project timelines. It took most of the morning. What I found made my hands go cold in a way the recording, somehow, hadn't quite managed to. 4 of my last 6 extended trips had no documented business justification whatsoever. The Pittsburgh audit that was supposed to run 3 days had, according to the actual supplier correspondence, been fully scheduled to wrap in a day and a half from the beginning. Colin had added the extra time himself, after the fact, in an internal memo that never went through the standard approval chain. I found 2 more instances exactly like it, going back 8 months. Colin hadn't just been managing my career. He'd been managing my absence. I want to stop here for a second, because I think this is the moment that actually mattered most in the entire process of putting this together, more than the recording, more than anything I'd eventually find. Sitting alone in my office that Thursday morning, staring at a spreadsheet I'd built myself, I understood for the first time that this wasn't a single betrayal I'd stumbled into. It was an operation. Someone had been managing my life, on a schedule, for the better part of a year, and I had signed off on every single piece of it myself, trusting the formula, never checking the inputs. Priya, my assistant, found me at my desk around noon, and something in my face must have shown, because she asked, carefully, if everything was all right. I told her I was fine, just buried in the Pittsburgh reconciliation. She hesitated, then said something that stopped me cold, that she'd mentioned to me months earlier how strange it was that Colin insisted on routing my travel paperwork personally, and that she'd actually asked him about it once, directly, and he'd brushed her off in a way that felt, she said, off. I asked her what she meant by off. She said he'd gotten oddly defensive for such a small administrative question, told her it wasn't her concern, in a tone she'd never heard him use with her before. I didn't tell Priya what I'd seen the night before. I wasn't ready yet to say it out loud to anyone. But I asked her, as casually as I could manage, to quietly pull the full travel log for the past 18 months, everything routed through Colin's office rather than standard dispatch, framed as an internal audit request. She didn't ask why. I think, in hindsight, she already suspected something was wrong, and chose not to press me on it, a small act of discretion I'd come to appreciate far more once everything came apart. That afternoon, I drove to an electronics store 40 minutes outside Ashford, somewhere I wouldn't run into anyone I knew, and bought a small voice-activated recorder, the kind meant for meetings, not marriages. I told myself this was simply due diligence. I understand now it was also something else, a way of postponing the moment I'd have to actually feel any of this, by staying busy with the mechanics of proving it instead. Friday, I went home. Emily greeted me at the door exactly the way she always did, warm, unguarded, asking about the audit, about the drive, kissing me like nothing in the world had changed. I let her. I hugged her back. I want to be honest that this was the hardest single moment of the entire process, harder, even, than the 23 minutes in the hallway, because it required me to become, for the first time in 15 years, a person capable of lying convincingly to someone I loved. That weekend, I planted the recorder in the kitchen, inside a decorative bowl on the counter that never moved, and I began, carefully, listening to fragments of Emily's phone calls whenever she stepped into the next room without her phone, which was rare, but not never. Most of what I gathered over the following week was fragmentary and inconclusive, a hushed conversation cut short when she came back into the room, a text notification I glimpsed but couldn't screenshot fast enough. There was one moment, that Sunday, that I almost let derail everything. Emily's sister Renee called the house, and I overheard enough of Emily's side of the conversation to catch her saying, quietly, I know, I'm trying to figure out how to end it the right way, I just need a little more time. My stomach dropped, thinking she meant the affair, that she was already planning to leave the marriage on her own terms, that I might lose the chance to confront this the way I decided I needed to. I spent an entire anxious day convinced I was watching Emily quietly plan her own exit before I could finish building my case. It turned out, when I finally pieced it together days later, that she'd been talking about the design firm's boutique hotel contract, a project she'd genuinely been trying to extricate herself from due to a difficult client, a real, ordinary professional frustration that had nothing to do with Colin at all. I'd nearly let a completely unrelated thread convince me my whole plan was collapsing. It was a useful, humbling lesson in how easily fear reshapes ordinary noise into confirmation of your worst fear. The real breakthrough came the following Wednesday, exactly 1 week after the discovery, when Priya quietly handed me the travel log I'd requested, along with something I hadn't asked for, an internal email thread, forwarded to her by accident months earlier and simply archived without her fully registering its significance, between Colin and the regional HR director, discussing a proposed restructuring of my territory that would have relocated me to a satellite office 2 states away. Within the next fiscal year. The timeline in that email aligned, almost exactly, with the vague conversation Emily had started that spring about starting over somewhere new. I sat with that email for a long time. It confirmed something worse than the affair itself, that Colin hadn't simply been sleeping with my wife behind my back. He'd been actively engineering my professional removal from the picture entirely, using his position to build a future where Emily and I never had to formally confront anything, because I'd simply be transferred out of both of their lives. I didn't know it yet, but that restructuring email wasn't the last piece of coordinated planning I'd find between them, and the next one, when it surfaced 2 days later, would be so specific it would leave no room at all for either of them to explain it away. That Thursday night, I finally sat down with everything I had: the recording, the falsified travel extensions, the restructuring email, 3 still fragmentary audio clips from the kitchen recorder, and I understood I had enough. Not everything. But enough to walk into a room with both of them and leave no space for either version of the story they might try to tell me. I called my attorney the next morning. I met with my attorney, a measured, unflappable woman named Denise Calloway, on Friday morning, and laid out everything I had across her conference table: the recording, the falsified travel extensions, the restructuring email, the audio fragments. She listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she said something I've held on to since: "You've already done the hard part. Now we make sure you never have to do it twice." She advised me not to confront either of them until the divorce filing and a formal HR complaint were both fully prepared, so that the moment I finally spoke, there would be nothing left for either of them to negotiate. It took 11 more days. I stayed in the house that whole time, sleeping in the guest room under the excuse of a bad back, working with Denise in the evenings from my car in a grocery store parking lot so Emily wouldn't see the calls. I filed the divorce paperwork on a Tuesday. I submitted a formal HR complaint about Colin's conduct, backed by the falsified travel records, that same afternoon, timed precisely so both documents would land on the same day. I confronted them separately, by design. Colin first, on a Wednesday morning, in his office, with the door closed and Denise's advice: lay it out, ask nothing, leave room for nothing, sitting in my chest like ballast. "I know about you and Emily," I said. I set my phone on his desk, screen facing him, the recording already cued to the moment he'd laughed and said he'd handle me. "I know about the travel extensions you falsified going back 8 months. I know about the restructuring proposal for my territory. I have all of it, time-stamped, and copies are already with my attorney and with HR." Colin's face did something I'd never seen it do in 6 years, a total collapse of the easy authority he'd always carried, replaced by something scrambling and small. "William, let's talk about this like two reasonable." "There's nothing to talk about," I said. My voice was flatter than I expected it to be, flatter than I'd rehearsed. "You've already talked. I have 23 minutes of it." I stood up. "HR will be in touch. So will my lawyer." I walked out while he was still forming a sentence, and I didn't look back, though I heard him say my name once, sharply, behind me, in a tone that had nothing left of the confidence I'd spent 6 years reporting to. Emily, I confronted that same evening, at the house, after I'd already moved a suitcase of essentials into my car parked down the block, so that whatever happened in that kitchen, I wouldn't be walking back into a life still tangled with hers. She knew something was wrong the moment I walked in. Colin had clearly already called her, panicked, because her face had the particular ashen stillness of someone who already knows the shape of what's coming and is only waiting to hear the specifics. I laid the phone on the kitchen counter between us, next to the decorative bowl that had held the recorder for over a week, and played 30 seconds of it. Just 30 seconds. It was enough. Emily didn't deny anything. She sat down hard on one of the kitchen stools, and her hands were shaking so badly the first thing she said came out barely audible. "How long have you known?" 11 days, I said. "Since I came home early from Pittsburgh and found his car in the driveway." She made a sound then that wasn't quite a sob, more like all the air leaving her at once. "William, I need you to know, I need you to actually hear this, not just the recording, not just what it sounds like. Please, just let me explain. Let me tell you how this actually happened, because it isn't what you think, it's so much more complicated than what that recording makes it sound like." "Then tell me," I said. I sat down across from her, arms folded, voice level. "How long?" 10 months, she said, and something in her seemed to give way all at once, the composure she'd been trying to hold together finally cracking open. "It started, God, William, it started so stupidly. It was the company holiday party, 10 months ago. You'd left early because you weren't feeling well, remember? And I stayed because Colin's wife was there and we'd gotten to talking, and it was nothing, it was completely nothing, just two people who both felt a little invisible in their own marriages commiserating over cheap wine. That's genuinely how it started. Two people complaining about feeling unseen. The first time anything actually happened, it was 3 weeks later. He texted me something that wasn't inappropriate, not really, just checking in, asking how a doctor's appointment I'd mentioned had gone, and I remember standing in the kitchen reading it and feeling this ridiculous, embarrassing flood of warmth, because nobody had asked me a single specific question about my own life in longer than I want to admit. I told myself it was harmless. I told myself I was allowed to have someone notice the small things. I kept telling myself versions of that sentence for months, William. It's just texting. It's just lunch, once, because we were both downtown anyway. Every single time I let it go one step further, I had some smaller word ready to make it sound like less than it was. And I got so good at that, I got better at lying to myself than I ever got at lying to you, because I actually believed the smaller words while I was saying them. By that February, we were sleeping together, and I'm not going to sit here and dress that up as anything other than exactly what it was. But I need you to understand, not to excuse it, I know there's no excusing it, it was never really about wanting him instead of you. It was about wanting to feel, for an hour at a time, like a person who still surprised somebody. I don't even know when I stopped being that person in our own marriage. Somewhere in the last few years I became, I don't know how else to say this, I became furniture, William. Reliable, familiar furniture. And I know that sounds like I'm blaming you, or blaming us, and I'm not, because plenty of people feel exactly that way and don't do what I did. I did it because something in me was already hollowed out before I ever spoke to Colin at that party, and he just happened to be standing there when it cracked open. The fear started almost right away and it genuinely never left after that. I was terrified constantly, of you finding a receipt, of Renee slipping up on the phone, of somebody at the office noticing how often his door closed when I visited. I started rehearsing explanations in the shower, William. I want you to understand how disgusted I am even saying that out loud, that I stood in our bathroom some mornings, practicing what I'd say if you ever asked a certain question, the way you'd rehearse for a job interview. I became someone who rehearsed lies to her own husband while getting ready for the day, and I don't think I will ever stop being sick about that specific detail. The shame got physical, toward the end. I couldn't look at our wedding photo in the hallway some mornings, I'd walk past it with my coffee and have to look somewhere else entirely, because I couldn't hold both things in my head at once, you and what I was doing 3 towns away on a Tuesday afternoon. I stopped sleeping properly. I told myself, almost every week since spring, that this was the week I'd end it. And every single week I found some reason it had to be one more week, a fight with Colin about his own guilt, some small crisis that felt, in the moment, more urgent than doing the hard thing. I tried to end it twice before this. I never told you that. Once in March, once about a month ago. Both times I made it about 10 days before I went back. I don't say that to make any of this sound sympathetic. I say it because you asked for the truth, and the truest thing I can tell you is that I knew, every single time, that I was choosing it. Nobody made me, William. I chose it, for 10 months, and I let him reshape your entire career behind your back because some part of me had convinced myself that if you were simply transferred away, none of us would ever actually have to have this conversation. She stopped there, breathing hard, mascara down both cheeks in the same 2 clean lines I imagined Emily wearing, unknowingly, in some other version of this story. I let the silence sit for a long moment before I spoke. "Thank you for telling me the truth," I said. "All of it, finally." I stood up from the stool. "It doesn't change anything that happens next. The divorce is already filed. HR already has the falsified travel records. This isn't a conversation where anything gets decided. It's just the last one we're going to have." I picked up my keys from the counter, the same counter that had held a recorder in a decorative bowl for 8 days, and walked out to the car I'd already packed down the block, and I didn't look back at the house, though I heard Emily say my name once through the open door, in a voice with nothing left in it but the specific exhaustion of someone who has just heard every excuse fail, one after another, in real time. The company terminated Colin 11 days after my HR complaint landed, once their own internal investigation confirmed everything Denise and I had already documented, the falsified travel authorizations, the restructuring proposal built around removing me from my own territory without cause. He was let go for cause, which meant no severance, and word moved through the office the way these things always do, quietly at first and then all at once, until there wasn't a single person on our floor who didn't know exactly why. His wife, who I never met but heard had been blindsided completely, filed for divorce 3 weeks later. I heard, secondhand, that he took a position with a smaller regional distributor 2 states away, a significant step down from where he'd been, and that he pays alimony out of a salary considerably smaller than the one he'd once used to reshape other people's lives. The divorce from Emily finalized 4 months after that Wednesday night in the kitchen. Denise had built the case cleanly around the evidence, and with the affair and Colin's falsified records both a matter of documented record, Emily's attorney advised her not to contest much of anything. I kept the house. I kept the retirement accounts we'd built over 15 years, minus a negotiated settlement that gave Emily enough to start over, which I didn't fight, because by then I'd stopped needing the outcome to feel like a punishment. I just needed it to be over, cleanly, on paper, the way I'd wanted it from that first night in the motel. Emily moved into an apartment across town. I know, because Renee mentioned it once, unprompted, in a grocery store parking lot the following spring, that Emily still isn't seeing anyone, that she'd told her sister she didn't feel she'd earned the right to yet. I didn't ask for that detail. I didn't need it. It didn't change anything for me, one way or another, though I noticed, once Renee had said it, that I felt considerably less than I expected to feel, hearing it. I want to stop here for a second, because there's a specific realization that arrived for me somewhere in that grocery store parking lot, standing next to my own cart, that I hadn't expected. I'd spent months bracing for the moment I'd finally feel triumphant, or vindicated, or something large and satisfying. It never really arrived as a single moment. It arrived instead as an absence, the specific, quiet discovery that I'd stopped checking my phone the second I walked into a room, stopped running silent audits on every scheduled change at work, stopped, somewhere along the way, waiting for the next piece of evidence I'd need to gather. I promoted Priya to my old assistant role's senior tier that same spring, once the dust had settled at the office and a new regional director had been brought in from outside to replace Colin. She never asked me directly what had happened, though I think, by then, she understood most of it. She simply became, without either of us naming it, the one person at work I trusted the way I used to trust everyone by default, carefully, deliberately, because she'd earned it in specific, visible ways rather than because a title in front of her name told me to. I met Rachel the following autumn, almost a year after that Wednesday in Pittsburgh, at a supplier conference in Columbus I attended for the new regional director. She managed logistics for a competing distributor, and we ended up at the same overflow table during a lunch session neither of us particularly wanted to be at. She made a dry joke about the conference coffee that made me laugh harder than anything had in over a year, and I remember noticing, with a kind of surprised, cautious gratitude, that I still knew how to do that, laugh, easily, without checking first whether it was safe to. Rachel and I didn't move quickly. I told her, on our third date, most of what had happened, because I'd decided somewhere in that year that I didn't want to build anything new on the same foundation I'd built the last one on, trust granted once and never revisited. She listened, and she asked good, careful questions, and she didn't try to tell me how I should feel about any of it, which I came to understand, over the following months, was itself a kind of quiet gift. There's a phrase Emily used, that Wednesday night in the kitchen, that I've turned over more times than I can count since I became furniture. She meant it about herself, about how she'd stopped feeling seen in our marriage. But I think, in the year that followed, I understood it applied to something in me too, that I'd let myself become fixed and unquestioned in exactly the same way, trusting Colin and Emily both the way you trust a wall you've walked past 10,000 times without ever checking whether it was still load-bearing. I didn't build my new relationship with Rachel that way. I check the walls now. Not out of suspicion, out of respect for how much a life actually costs to rebuild, once you've had to do it from a single recording taken in a dark hallway. I could have stayed angry at both of them for years. Denise told me, near the end of the divorce proceedings, that plenty of her clients did exactly that, letting the case become the entire architecture of their next decade. I chose something else instead, somewhere in that quiet grocery store parking lot, without ever announcing it to anyone. That was the only real revenge that mattered, in the end, not the terminated career, not the finalized divorce, but simply refusing to let any of it keep managing my life the way Colin had once managed my travel schedule, month after month, without my ever noticing. Rachel and I have been together for almost 2 years now. I sleep through the night these days, most nights, which took longer to come back than I expected. I recognize myself again somewhere in that first year alone in the house, quieter, steadier, considerably less willing to sign off on trust the way I used to sign off on a formula, without ever checking the inputs again. I still think, sometimes, about that decorative bowl on the kitchen counter, the one that held a recorder for 8 days without Emily ever once suspecting it was there. I gave it to Goodwill along with most of the kitchenware, the week I moved Rachel's things in. Some objects just aren't worth keeping, even once they've stopped meaning anything at all. That's my story, a BMW in the driveway, a bowl on the counter, 23 minutes that ended 2 careers and 1 marriage. Thank you for staying with me through all of it. If any part of this hit close to home, tell me in the comments. I read every one, and I'd genuinely love to hear your own story too. See you in the next one.